Saipan, June 1944. The radio crackles in the underground command bunker. Japanese officers lean forward, listening intently to the voice cutting through static. It speaks in flawless, formal Japanese, the kind taught in Tokyo's best schools. The tone is calm, authoritative, unmistakably educated. The words are precise, the grammar impeccable, the accent refined. But something is wrong. The message orders a tactical withdrawal to coordinates that make no sense. A colonel's eyes narrow. He glances at his communication officer, who is pale, confused. The voice sounds more correct than their own field reports, more proper than the regional dialects of their frontline troops. It carries the weight of imperial training, the cadence of military academia. Yet it is a lie. Somewhere across the battlefield, behind American lines, a young man born in California speaks into a captured Japanese radio set. His parents are behind barbed wire in a desert camp in Arizona. His loyalty has been questioned since Pearl Harbor. But his Japanese is perfect, better in fact than that of the soldiers he is deceiving. And in this moment, as the enemy command hesitates, follows, fractures, he is winning a war with words his grandparents taught him. Before the war, they were farmers, shopkeepers, fishermen, students. They lived along the coasts of California, Oregon, and Washington in tight communities where Japanese was spoken at home and English at school. The children of immigrants, they straddled two worlds. Their parents had come from Japan decades earlier, seeking opportunity, building lives in a country that promised freedom but never quite granted belonging. These second-generation Japanese Americans, the Nisei, grew up attending American schools, pledging allegiance to the American flag, playing baseball, and listening to jazz. But at home, they spoke the language of their ancestors. They learned respect, hierarchy, formality. They read Japanese newspapers, attended cultural festivals, and absorbed a linguistic precision their parents insisted upon. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor shattered everything. Overnight, Japanese faces became suspect. Neighbors who had once been friends now looked away. FBI agents arrived in the night, arresting community leaders without explanation. Fear spread like wildfire through the Japanese-American community, but it was nothing compared to the fear spreading through white America. Newspaper editorials screamed about sabotage and fifth columns. Politicians demanded action. The public wanted someone to blame, and the people who looked like the enemy became the enemy. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It was a bureaucratic phrase for a human catastrophe. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens by birth, were ordered to leave their homes. They were given days, sometimes hours. Families sold their businesses for pennies, abandoned farms their parents had cultivated for decades, packed what they could carry. They were sent to assembly centers, horse stalls at racetracks, fairgrounds, hastily built camps, before being transported to remote internment camps in desolate stretches of desert and swampland. Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain, Topaz. 10 camps scattered across the interior, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers where American citizens were imprisoned without trial, without charge, for the crime of their ancestry. The irony was bitter and immediate. While families were detained, while fathers and mothers watched their children grow up behind fences, the United States military realized it had a problem. Japan was the enemy in the Pacific, and America had almost no one who could speak, read, or understand Japanese. Military intelligence was blind. Captured documents went untranslated. Intercepted radio transmissions were gibberish. Prisoners of war could not be interrogated. The War Department needed linguists desperately, and the only Americans who spoke Japanese fluently were the very people the government had just declared a threat to national security. So the government made a choice that would define one of the war's strangest contradictions. It asked the Nisei to serve. It asked young men whose families were imprisoned to prove their loyalty by fighting for the country that had stripped them of their freedom. Some refused, angry and betrayed, but thousands answered the call. Some volunteered out of patriotism, believing in American ideals even when America did not believe in them. Others saw it as the only way to prove their families were not the enemy. And some simply wanted to fight the country their parents had left behind to show they were American in the only way that might be believed. In November 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army had quietly established the 4th Army Intelligence School at the Presidio in San Francisco. It was a small operation designed to train a handful of officers in Japanese language. After the attack, the program became urgent. But by mid-1942, the West Coast was a forbidden zone for Japanese Americans. The school had to move. It relocated to an old civilian conservation corps camp in the hills of Minnesota, far from the hysteria of the coast. Camp Savage became the unlikely heart of America's most secret linguistic weapon. The Military Intelligence Service Language School opened in a place where most people had never seen a Japanese person. Minnesota winters were brutal, nothing like the mild climates most Nisei knew. But the isolation was intentional. Here, away from public anger and political pressure, the Army could train the soldiers it desperately needed. The first class began with 60 students. By the end of the war, more than 6,000 Nisei had passed through the program, first at Camp Savage and later at the larger Fort Snelling. They were taught by white officers and Nisei instructors, many of whom had been teachers or scholars before the war. The curriculum was intense, designed to produce combat-ready linguists in months, not years. Students studied military terminology, the formal language of orders and reports, the specialized vocabulary of naval operations, aircraft identification, and battlefield communications. They learned to read maps in Japanese, to decipher handwritten documents, to recognize regional dialects. The instructors drilled them relentlessly. Classes ran from dawn until late into the night. There were written exams, oral exams, translation exercises under time pressure. The standards were unforgiving. Those who could not keep pace were reassigned. Those who excelled became some of the most valuable soldiers America would deploy in the Pacific. What made the Nisei linguists extraordinary was not just their fluency, but the nature of that fluency. Most had learned Japanese at home in communities where the language was preserved as it had been spoken in the Meiji era, formal and structured. Their parents had taught them respect language, the hierarchy of verb forms, the proper way to address superiors. They had attended Japanese language schools after their American classes, studying kanji and grammar with the rigor of traditional education. Many could read classical texts, write formal letters, navigate the complexities of honorifics that even native speakers found difficult. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, spoke the language of their regions. A farmer's son from Kyushu had a thick dialect. A factory worker from Osaka spoke rough, colloquial Japanese. Many frontline troops had limited education, pulled from rural villages and thrust into military service. They knew the crude language of the barracks, the slang of soldiers, the abbreviated speech of men under fire. Their Japanese was functional, direct, often ungrammatical. They had never needed the formal precision the Nisei had been taught. This gap would become a weapon. When Nisei linguists intercepted Japanese communications, they understood not just the words but the layers of meaning, the formality that indicated rank, the subtleties that revealed intent. When they interrogated prisoners, they spoke with an authority that confused and disarmed. And when they went on the offensive, using captured radios to broadcast false orders, they sounded more legitimate than the officers those orders were supposed to come from. The Japanese military had built its communication systems on assumptions of linguistic and cultural unity. The Nisei shattered those assumptions, and the enemy never fully understood how. The contradiction was cruel and profound. While soldiers trained in Minnesota, their parents and siblings lived behind barbed wire. Letters between them were censored. Families did not know where their sons were, what they were doing, or if they would survive. The young men who volunteered carried a double burden. They had to prove themselves to a military that did not entirely trust them, and they had to endure the knowledge that their sacrifice might never be enough to free their families. Some were sent directly from internment camps to training, trading one form of confinement for another. Others visited the camps on leave, seeing their mothers and fathers aged by worry, their younger siblings growing up in tar paper barracks, and then returned to prepare for war. The psychological weight was immense, but they carried it in silence because complaining would only confirm the doubts of those who questioned their loyalty. The reason the Nisei spoke better Japanese than many soldiers in the Imperial Army was rooted in education and class. Japan in the early 20th century was a society in transition. Universal education existed in theory, but quality varied wildly. Rural children often left school early to work. Urban children had access to better teachers, more resources, longer schooling. The Japanese military drew heavily from the countryside, where young men spoke regional dialects shaped by centuries of isolation. These dialects were mutually intelligible, but they were not the formal standardized Japanese taught in Tokyo's schools or used in official documents. Nisei, on the other hand, had learned Japanese in a preserved, almost fossilized form. Their immigrant parents had left Japan during the Meiji or Taisho periods, carrying with them the formal language of that era. Japanese language schools in America taught classical grammar, proper sentence structure, and respectful speech. The Nisei were educated in a version of Japanese that was, in many ways, more correct than what was spoken by the average Japanese soldier. On the battlefield, this superiority was immediate and tactical. Nisei linguists accompanied frontline units translating captured documents in real time. A single intercepted order could reveal enemy positions, troop strengths, planned counterattacks. Diaries taken from dead soldiers contained invaluable intelligence about morale, supply conditions, and command intentions. Maps and code books were useless to American officers but transparent to the Nisei. In the chaos of island fighting where every advantage mattered, the ability to read the enemy's own words often meant the difference between a successful assault and a deadly ambush. During the campaign in the Solomon Islands, Nisei translators deciphered documents that exposed the locations of Japanese airfields and supply depots. On New Guinea, intercepted messages revealed troop movements, allowing American forces to position themselves for devastating ambushes. The intelligence was so reliable that commanders began requesting Nisei linguists by name. But translation was only part of their mission. The most audacious use of Nisei linguists was in psychological warfare and tactical deception. Using captured radios, they broadcast false orders to Japanese units. They impersonated officers, directing troops into kill zones or ordering retreats that fractured defensive lines. The voice on the radio sounded like command because it spoke with the authority and precision of command. Japanese soldiers trained to obey without question often complied. In one operation on Saipan, a Nisei linguist convinced an isolated unit that American forces were about to deploy poison gas, a false threat that sent the soldiers fleeing from a strategically vital position. In another, false evacuation orders caused an entire company to abandon a defensive stronghold hours before an American assault. The Japanese had no defense against tiers. Their communication security assumed that only Japanese speakers could understand their transmissions, and it never occurred to them that the enemy might not only understand but also speak back with flawless accuracy. For the Japanese command, the phenomenon was deeply unsettling. Reports began filtering back from the front lines about radio transmissions that sounded authentic but gave nonsensical or contradictory orders. Officers questioned their own communication networks. Paranoia spread. Some suspected spies within their ranks, ethnic Koreans or Chinese, who had been conscripted and might harbor resentment. Others theorized about Japanese-speaking white officers, though such individuals were extraordinarily rare and never spoke with native fluency. The truth that Japanese Americans were turning the language of the empire against itself was so unexpected that many refused to believe it. Captured Japanese officers, when interrogated by Nisei linguists, often reacted with shock. Some demanded to know where their interrogator had been educated, convinced they were speaking to someone trained in Tokyo. When told they were speaking to an American, many simply refused to accept it. The cognitive dissonance was too great. How could the enemy speak better Japanese than they did? The intelligence breakthroughs enabled by Nisei linguists extended beyond the battlefield. At higher levels, they assisted in code-breaking efforts, translating decrypted messages from Japanese naval and army communications. They worked alongside cryptanalysts, providing linguistic and cultural context that turned raw intercepts into actionable intelligence. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, translated messages revealed Japanese fleet movements, allowing American carrier groups to position themselves for a decisive victory. In Burma, Nisei linguists attached to British and Chinese forces translated captured Japanese plans, enabling coordinated offensives that pushed the enemy back through the jungle. Their contributions were classified, their names unknown even to the units they supported. Generals praised the intelligence without knowing its source. Battles were won because of insights the Nisei provided, but the men themselves remained invisible, shadows in a war that did not want to acknowledge them. The full weight of Nisei linguistic operations became apparent during the Mariana Islands campaign in the summer of 1944. Saipan was a fortress, a strategic island that would bring American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. The Japanese defended it with fanatical determination. Nearly 30,000 troops dug into caves, bunkers, and fortified positions across the island's volcanic terrain. American forces expected brutal fighting, and they got it. But they also got an advantage the Japanese did not anticipate. Nisei linguists landed with the Marines on June 15, 1944. Within hours, they were translating captured documents that revealed the layout of Japanese defenses. Maps showed bunker locations, ammunition depots, command posts. Orders intercepted from field radios indicated where reinforcements were being sent, where supplies were running low, where morale was breaking. The intelligence flowed in faster than commanders could process it. One Nisei linguist moving with a reconnaissance patrol found a satchel on a dead Japanese officer. Inside were detailed plans for a counterattack scheduled for that night. The translation reached American commanders with hours to spare. Artillery was repositioned. Reinforcements were moved into place. When the Japanese attacked, they ran into a killing field. The counterattack, which might have shattered the American beachhead, was annihilated. But the most extraordinary operation came in late June as American forces pushed toward the island's interior. Japanese command was losing cohesion. Units were isolated, communication lines were severed, and confusion was spreading. A Nisei team led by Sergeant Hoichi Kubo made a decision that would define the rest of the campaign. They set up a captured Japanese radio in an abandoned bunker and began broadcasting orders in perfect military Japanese. They impersonated a senior staff officer using the formal speech and command terminology that only someone of high rank would use. The voice directed scattered units to regroup at specific coordinates, ostensibly to form a new defensive line. In reality, those coordinates placed them directly in the path of advancing American armor and artillery. Japanese soldiers, desperate for leadership and trained to obey, followed the orders. Over the next 48 hours, hundreds of troops moved into positions where they were surrounded and destroyed. Some units realized too late that they had been deceived. Others never understood. Radio transmissions intercepted later showed Japanese officers arguing over the authenticity of the orders, but by then the damage was done. The false commands accelerated the collapse of organized resistance on Saipan. When the island fell on July 9th, more than 24,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. American casualties were heavy, but intelligence analysts later estimated that the Nisei operations had shortened the battle by days and saved thousands of American lives. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, Nisei linguists intercepted transmissions that revealed the location of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's command bunker. Air and naval bombardment targeted the position, disrupting Japanese coordination at a critical phase of the battle. On Okinawa in April, false radio orders directed Japanese artillery to shift positions, exposing them to American counter-battery fire. Captured prisoners interrogated by Nisei linguists provided information on cave networks, supply caches, and the locations of civilian refugees, intelligence that saved both military and civilian lives as the brutal three-month battle unfolded. One incident on Okinawa crystallized the psychological impact. A captured Japanese colonel was brought to an interrogation tent. The Nisei linguist assigned to question him introduced himself in flawless Japanese, using the respectful forms appropriate for addressing a senior officer. The colonel stared, confused. He asked where the linguist had learned to speak. The Nisei explained in careful formal Japanese that he was an American. Born in California, educated in the United States. The colonel shook his head. He insisted it was impossible. He had fought in China, in Manchuria, across the Pacific. He had heard many languages, many accents. But this was not the Japanese of a foreigner. This was the Japanese of an educated man, of someone who understood not just words but culture, hierarchy, respect. The Nisei repeated that he was American. The colonel fell silent. When the interrogation resumed, he answered questions mechanically, but something in him had broken. The realization that the enemy understood Japan more deeply than he had imagined shattered his certainty. Japanese command tried to adapt. They changed codes, altered frequencies, issued warnings about false transmissions. But the measures were too little, too late. The Nisei had already penetrated too deeply. Every captured radio became a weapon. Every translated document opened new vulnerabilities. The Japanese had built their entire communication strategy on the assumption of linguistic security, and that assumption was collapsing. In the final months of the war, intercepted transmissions revealed a growing awareness among Japanese officers that something was fundamentally wrong. Some speculated about traitors. Others blamed poor training. A few came close to the truth, suggesting that Japanese speakers outside Japan might be involved, but even they underestimated the scale and sophistication of the Nisei operations. By the time the atomic bombs fell in August 1945, Nisei linguists had been involved in nearly every major Pacific campaign. They had translated surrender broadcasts, interrogated high-ranking officers, and assisted in the occupation planning that would follow Japan's capitulation. General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur, later stated that the Nisei linguists shortened the Pacific War by 2 years and saved countless lives. It was a claim that could never be fully verified, but those who had seen the intelligence, who had watched battles turn on translated orders and intercepted plans, believed it. The Nisei had fought a war within a war, invisible and unacknowledged, and they had won. When the war ended, the Nisei came home to a country that still did not entirely trust them. Their contributions remained classified for decades. Families were released from internment camps, but they returned to communities where their homes had been sold, their businesses taken over, their reputations destroyed. The men who had served in the military intelligence service could not speak about what they had done. Secrecy oaths kept them silent. Neighbors saw them as veterans, but not the kind celebrated in parades. There were no headlines, no medal ceremonies, no public acknowledgement. The 452nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese-American soldiers who fought in Europe, became famous for their bravery and sacrifice, but the Nisei linguists of the Pacific remained ghosts. For many, the return was painful. They had sacrificed for a country that had imprisoned their families. They had proven their loyalty in the most dangerous and intimate way possible, using the language and culture they had been taught to honor and turning it into a weapon against the land of their ancestors. The psychological cost was immense. Some struggled with Iden. Titty caught between two cultures that both felt like betrayals. Others buried their experiences, never speaking of the war even to their own children. The silence was a second imprisonment, self-imposed but no less real. Japanese military officials in the years after surrender slowly began to understand what had happened. Post-war interrogations and intelligence reviews revealed the extent of the deception operations. Former officers were shocked to learn that American soldiers had been impersonating Japanese command. Some expressed admiration, acknowledging the skill and audacity required. Others felt humiliated, unable to reconcile the fact that their linguistic and cultural superiority, a core assumption of Japanese imperial ideology, had been turned against them so completely. Documents captured during the occupation included internal Japanese military analyses that speculated about the identity of the mysterious radio operators. The truth, when it finally emerged in declassified American reports, was met with disbelief and grudging respect. It was not until the 1970s that the story of the Nisei linguists began to emerge publicly. Declassification of wartime intelligence files allowed veterans to finally speak. Historians began interviewing survivors, piecing together a narrative that had been hidden for 30 years. Books and documentaries followed, and slowly recognition came. In 2000, the U.S. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service, collectively honoring the Japanese-American soldiers who had served during World War II. It was the highest civilian honor, and for many Nisei veterans, it was the first time their government had publicly acknowledged what they had done. The numbers tell part of the story. Estimates suggest that Nisei linguists were involved in the interrogation of more than 14,000 Japanese prisoners. They translated millions of pages of captured documents. Intelligence derived from their work influenced planning for nearly every major Pacific operation from 1943 onward. General Willoughby's claim that they shortened the war by 2 years may be impossible to prove, but even conservative estimates suggest they saved tens of thousands of American lives and contributed decisively to Allied victory. Yet for decades, the men who made those contributions lived in silence, their service known only to the classified files and the memories of those who had fought beside them. For the Japanese-American community, the legacy is complex. The Nisei soldiers had proven their loyalty, but at a cost that should never have been demanded. Families had been torn apart, careers had been destroyed, an entire generation had been forced to choose between bitterness and sacrifice, and those who chose sacrifice did so knowing they might never be believed. The internment camps were a moral failure, a betrayal of American principles. The service of the Nisei could not erase that failure, but it did reveal something essential about identity, courage, and resilience. They had fought for an ideal even when that ideal had been abandoned by the country they served. Memorials now stand at Fort Snelling and other sites where the Nisei trained. Museums preserve their stories. Schools teach about the 442nd and the Military Intelligence Service. Veterans, those still living, are honored at ceremonies and invited to share their experiences. The recognition is real, but it came too late for many. Thousands of Nisei veterans died before their service was acknowledged, before the files were opened, before the silence was broken. Their children and grandchildren carry the stories now, ensuring that the sacrifices are not forgotten. The irony remains sharp. The men who spoke Japanese better than the Japanese, who proved their loyalty by deceiving the enemy in the language of their ancestors, were the same men whose families were imprisoned for looking like the enemy. That contradiction is part of American history now, uncomfortable and indelible. War reveals language as more than communication. It becomes identity, weapon, and bridge. The Nisei linguists existed in a space between worlds, belonging fully to neither but fluent in both. They carried their grandparents' words into battle against the country those grandparents had left behind. They spoke with a precision that exposed the lie of cultural unity, proving that language is learned, not inherited, and that loyalty is chosen, not determined by blood. The Japanese command could not believe American soldiers spoke better Japanese than their own troops because they had built an empire on assumptions of racial and cultural purity. The Nisei shattered those assumptions every time they opened their mouths. What remains is a story about the complexity of identity in wartime, about the choices people make when their loyalty is questioned, and about the quiet courage of those who serve without recognition. The Nisei did not fight for glory. They fought to prove something that should never have needed proof, and in doing so, they changed the course of the war and left a legacy that transcends the battles they helped win. The voice on the radio, perfect and calm, speaking the enemy's language better than the enemy could, is a reminder that in war, as in life, the most powerful weapons are often the ones that cannot be seen. Language, identity, and loyalty, these were the tools the Nisei carried, and with them, they helped bring an empire to its knees.